What I'd like to do is ask our last three speakers if they could each take a minute and just answer a question for us about why they do what they do. You know, do they feel hope and what keeps you going on this mission?
Puedo empezar. Bueno, yo hago lo que hago porque mi país necesita gente que esté comprometida con acabar esta crisis. No hay muchos veterinarios, yo soy veterinaria y trato de hacer lo mejor que puedo para ayudar a los loros en cautiverio y también en vida libre, porque también trabajo con, con guacamayos y loros de vida libre. Eh, Trato de siempre hablar con las personas. Antes cuando atendía a loros mascota, hoy ya no atiendo loros mascota, pero antes hablaba mucho con los propietarios y les explicaba sobre los problemas y sobre darles una mejor calidad de vida. Y también hablo mucho con los veterinarios para que todos tengamos como una visión unificada del problema que el cautiverio causa en ellos y también en otros animales silvestres.
Thank you.
I'll go next. I definitely believe that there's hope. I hold on for the animals. I hold on for the hope for them. I hope to see the suffering end for all of parrots in captivity, and really for all exotic animals that are living in the confines of captivity. You know, it's so important to get out there and educate, especially our younger generations. I love going into classrooms and working with children and seeing their eyes light up and seeing our younger generation wanting to take part in this, wanting to take action. You know, typically when we go into schools, especially like high schools and elementary schools, there are students that say, hey, my uncle has this parrot or my parents have this parrot. I'm going to go home and tell them that they're not taking care of them right, or they're not doing this correctly. And we could do this so much better. And really, you know, getting together and talking about education and talking about these issues with different groups of people all over the world is so critically important. And I definitely think that there is a movement and that we are moving in the right direction. And I just want to tell everybody, I know how exhausting this work is. I've been doing this for a long time as well. It is emotionally draining. But at the end of the day, we are making a difference. Every small step we take is putting us in the greater direction. And we just got to keep fighting and we just got to keep educating.
Excellent.
I can go next. Yeah, I'm definitely hopeful for the future. I do believe, as I said, at least the piece I work on, which is the retail pet industry, is solvable. And I believe everyone in their various expertises can find something they think is solvable and go from there. It feels overwhelming, but I don't know, for example, if some people saw in the news that Petco announced it was going to start selling rabbits again. The reaction was swift and overwhelming. And they said they're not going to sell them. So I do think there's a lot of, I think we as an animal protection movement in the US have a strange relationship with Petco and PetSmart. There's a lot of work to be done there. And I think we can move these companies. And I think when we move the largest companies, the rest will follow suit. You know, today most places don't sell dogs, and there's a reason for that. It's a reputational risk. And we have to make the same for birds and other animals.
So what would a mass campaign look like? If any of you have thoughts on that? What is the next level, you know, after discussion? What would it really take to make this action something we see?
For me, a mass campaign in the US is the legislative piece. I think the rabbits also are an example of that, because the reason Petco wanted to start selling rabbits again in the South is because there weren't as many laws. As I mentioned, there are some laws banning the sale of rabbits. So, you know, corporate policies are a good start, but we need laws next. And I think when more places start introducing these laws, it's going to put them on notice. And I think that goes hand in hand with education. and the other like awareness raising campaigns we do. But they work hand in hand, but I do think we ultimately all need to be putting our focus on laws and policies, because that it makes the business model untenable. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with what happened with elephants and circuses, but the reason ultimately Ringling stopped using elephants and now there are almost no elephants in circuses is because so many cities passed bullhook bans and it no longer became financially feasible for Ringling to travel the country. And I think we need to follow the same theory of change for pet stores.
So in a lot of ways, we need government intervention that we just don't see right now. We need city, state, local municipalities, federal regulations that unfortunately, at least in the United States, our political climate the last 8 or 10, 12 years has not really been one that allows for animal law and animal movement. It's just so low on the list when you think about all of the other issues going on. And our move towards how we can get government to help us has been a challenge. Karen?
Yeah, just quickly, thank you, Liz, for, listing some of the cities that have included birds in their legislation. But if you look across the country, I mean, it's just a endless, number of municipalities that have pet sale bans, but very few of them include birds. And so one of the things that people can do is to approach their legislators and say, you need to get birds on this legislation. Even the city of Boston, the statewide legislation does not include birds, as far as I know, unless they added them recently. But Cambridge and Arlington have done an amazing job. But birds are not included. And they are the animals that suffer most prolifically in the pet trade. So we need to get them into the legislation.
See a hand raised by Barbara? No.
We are taking questions from attendees through the chat. Karen is the speaker. That's why she got called upon.
Do any of our panelists have newer ideas? What does this look like as we start thinking outside the box that we're talking about? Newer ideas for expanding, comments we've seen about educating the younger generation, reaching a larger audience, talking to new people, and something we've discussed, which has been changing views and changing strong, deep-rooted opinions. What does that look like? How does that happen?
En Paraguay, uno de los mayores problemas que tenemos y dificultades es la extrema pobreza que hay en estos pueblos donde hay mayor cantidad de saqueos de nidos, de guacamayos, de loros, inclusive de individuos adultos. Entonces, pienso que aparte de la educación, que sí, las generaciones jóvenes y las futuras generaciones son el camino, pero además de eso, empezar a trabajar en mejorarles la calidad de vida y los medios de vida, porque si es más fácil para ellos para poder comer, vender un loro, lo van a seguir haciendo. Entonces hay que mejorar también las condiciones económicas de ellos para que esa ya no sea una opción.
We had a question that somebody wanted to propose to the group about how to talk to somebody who is sort of a small scale breeder or breeding their birds or allowing their pet birds to breed in the scope of some of the things we've talked about. What are thoughts on that? It can be a complex and challenging issue, but what thoughts do we have on that?
I've actually ran into this situation quite a few times with my work at Foster Parrots. I've had people reach out to me and they have said, "Hey, I want to adopt a bird, and I've bred all these finches or I've bred all these parakeets in my lifetime." And of course, my first reaction is always being really horrified. But I have found that taking a gentle approach with them and really just talking about, the plight of parrots. And so many people are like, "Oh, well, I just love birds so much that I keep breeding them." And they lack the knowledge and they lack the education that's behind all of this, that's fueling it, right? They oftentimes don't realize that there's such a need for parrot rescue and how high the surrender requests are. And even now, like we recently had posted on our social media about the sheer number of surrender requests that we had been seeing this year. And I have people reaching out to me all over the place saying, "Oh my God, I had no idea." So really just opening up that conversation. Are you going to win them all? Absolutely not. But I think it's extremely important to open up those conversations with people. And even those, applications and for rescues that you look at and you're like, "Oh my gosh, I would never adopt this person." That may be true. We may not put another bird into their care, but we certainly will interview them just to have that educational piece, just to talk to them and maybe hopefully just help change their minds.
Good information. Something that we all face. And I just got a message that Gail has a question to share with us.
I hope you can hear me. My earbuds died. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Actually, were two related questions, and they came from Birdism, I think, was the source. What to say to breeders who say that they're helping species that might go extinct if they don't breed them? And then a follow-up question to that is there a way to convert breeders into actual legit conservationists?
Go ahead, Karen.
Well, this is a tough one for me because it's difficult for me to be diplomatic about this. But as I've said, the only real conservation, breeding for conservation, is in situ in the countries of origin where these birds belong, where they will be released. Breeding for conservation in captivity is just the pet trade. That's all it is.
And one aspect of that has to do with the concept specifically of lay people's thought about sort of repatriation, or the thought that conservationists are breeding and then releasing these birds, that we have this massive movement of breeders who produce birds that then go back into the wild. And we know that specifically is an enormous challenge. And although it's starting and it's happening probably more than ever, rewilding, re-releasing, getting birds back into the wild that have found their way into captivity has its own set of enormous challenges. And although there's some movement, that's not the scope of what a lay person thinks when they hear that. When people think that breeders produce these birds and then they get released back into the wild, and that's not the standard of what we see currently.
I'd like to add also that I think this is an example of something where it's connected to other animal issues. I think our people's understanding of like the zoo industry also leads to problems where like breeders making these claims, because we have these very, very incorrect ideas about conservation. We see like, this little hippo Mudang in Thailand who lives in a horrific zoo. They're not doing conservation, but it's all over the internet. And that is connected, I think, to the parrot crisis in the US, where people believe conservation just means breeding and maintaining in captivity. And when we continue to have like fawning articles in People magazine and, about these animals in captivity, that's what leads to, because I deal with the same thing with reptiles. People are breeding these reptiles in their basement and they say they're conservationists. And I think we have to approach it, I know many people, my focus, my individual expertise, and many people on this call is probably the pet industry, but it relates to how we view animals in general. And I think it's pushing back against this, breaking this conservation myth.
One more interesting point. Okay, sun parakeets, sun conures, one of the most highly endangered birds on the planet, one of the most prolifically surrendered birds in captivity. They are coming at us from all directions. Nobody wants them in captivity. They're so loud. So these breeding for conservation of some parakeets is really feeding the unwanted parrot problem in the United States. So stop it.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I work with the indigenous people with the sun parakeet in Guyana, and they submitted a video, but it didn't quite make it. They would ask us repeatedly, stop it. They don't want their native birds in cages anywhere, and they don't want to have to risk their life for international buyers coming to take the remaining birds that are left. I can't speak for them, but this is what they have told me.
I have another question. It's not really a question, but it's related to what you're talking about. It says there are many zoos involved with reintroduction and management programs like the Hawaiian crow and other Hawaiian species. So what about the roles of zoos in similar institutions?
Well, I guess we'd have to ask, are the zoos actually releasing the birds in their native habitats? Because otherwise, once again, it's just captivity.
Sí, nosotros creo que es diferente hablar de criadores reproduciendo para conservación o conservación entre comillas que instituciones zoológicas que realmente hacen un trabajo serio y siguen ciertos parámetros de conservación y lo hacen para liberar animales en sus hábitats naturales. Entonces, yo trabajo en un zoológico, nosotros tenemos un proyecto de conservación con Ara ararauna, el guacamayo azul y amarillo. Es nativo para nosotros, tenemos muchos animales que provienen del tráfico y entonces nosotros sí tenemos un programa para devolverles al lugar que es su lugar de origen.
And my understanding as well is, zoos are not generally places where there is a lot of captive breeding. Based on zoos regulations, the species survival plan, some of those restrictions in what the AZA regulates zoos to do is they're not generally breeding and producing animals. I know that sometimes another zoo may want a tiger, so they'll breed, things like that, but they're not sources of breeding to add to conservation efforts. It's not that a lot of zoos aren't interested in conservation and work towards it, but that is often not a primary goal for a lot of zoos.
I have one last question, and then I think we'll move on to the breakout groups, which is somebody has been asking, how can we be creative, just like we've been maybe paying people to help with conservation in other countries, in places like the US and other countries where there are a lot of breeders? How can we be creative to come up with ways that those people can earn an income, maybe with the skills they have, or somehow helping with the problem instead of hurting? Any ideas about how to turn breeders into protectors, perhaps?
One of the ways that we hear over and over is dissemination of information and education. It sounds very basic to say that, but sharing the messages, sharing the information, looking to what factual information we have, looking at the science, looking at the statistics, looking at information like, for example, what Liz presented, with what's happening in pet stores. I mean, we have an obligation as one part of answering that is to really look at that and see what that teaches us and tells us and how much that helps us push things in the right direction. Somebody in the chat wrote, spread the good word of bird.